In this presentation, I want to give an update on some of the developments in the cassava market and their implications for managing pests and disease. In terms of the project design, this includes Objective 1.1 and Objective 1.2. Objective 1.1 tries to understand how the markets impact the sustainability of some of the interventions that we are trying to introduce. Objective 1.2 starts to look at the economics in terms of the impact of disease and the benefits of interventions such as the introduction of new planting material or varieties. Again, in terms of the project design, 1.1 fits into the market and policy scenarios, which feeds into the economic analysis. This subsequently flows into some of the looking at the decisions, willingness to pay for clean planting material that goes towards developing the sustainable business models. The framework that we use in this analysis is based on what was developed for the ACIAR Cassava Value Chains and Livelihood Program, where we start off looking at what's happening in global markets and policies, how that flows through into local value chains and policies at the local level, and then how that impacts household livelihoods and decision making. We then look at the economics of the plot level trials, and then subsequently we would look at how that impacts different value chain actors as we come back out, to look at the incentive for other partnerships to invest in bringing those solutions to farmers. When we talk about cassava markets, it's important again to remember that both the demand and supply depend on what's happening in substitute markets, often outside the area of Asia. In these graphs, we can look at what's happening in world maize, sugar, and cassava prices. From the period of 2017 to more recently, cassava was trading at a premium over maize. In the early 2000s, maize prices both on the world market, here US maize, and also in China began to increase rapidly. As prices of maize increased, this once again created demand for cassava chips and starch from Southeast Asia. We also look at what's happening in perennial crops and what that means for often the area converted to cassava or other crops. We know in Laos, areas of coffee were getting converted into cassava. This is important as when there's area expansion, this tends to require planting material from outside the region, and in the case of Laos was leading to the introduction of planting material from Thailand and Vietnam, often with carrying disease. Of course, now cassava markets are tied to energy markets, and we can see what's happening with biofuel prices, which is also related to maize and oil prices. Again, more recently, prices going up. As always, the rising maize prices in China create demand for cassava products, which in the short term has led to an increase in the demand for cassava from Southeast Asia and pushed out the extensive margin. Of course, now in China, we'll start to see farmers increase the area of maize and we might see prices come off. We always talk about the cassava sector needing to balance the need for high enough prices to encourage farmers to plant the crop and not too high prices that they become uncompetitive against other substitutes. Here you can see the price of cassava starch versus US maize starch. In this period here, processors start to look for substitutes, especially in those markets where there's no real need for cassava starch based on its functional properties. As the price of maize starts to rise, then again we start to see demand for places like Indonesia who are no longer importing maize starch. So these relative prices are important in terms of understanding smallholder decisions in terms of what crops to grow. So again, when sugarcane prices in Thailand were low, we saw an increase in the area of cassava production. It also, the difference between cassava roots and cassava starch and cassava chips often defines how farmers process their roots. again, this influences the connectivity between farmers and different value chain actors. So if you create a business model around a starch factory and then the difference between starch and chips increases, then farmers start to produce their own chips, often breaking down those business models that were created. So once again, understanding these dynamics is important to understanding the sustainability of any business models we try to set up. The farm gate prices obviously impact the economics of pest and disease and the incentive to adopt new technologies. This includes the purchase of new varieties or clean planting material. As usually, the benchmark prices in Tay Ninh or in Korat in Thailand tend to set the market in those areas. Prices then fall away in terms of logistic costs to get it to those main markets. So here you have the price in Tay Ninh, the border with Cambodia, and then increasingly more distant provinces from that border point. Similarly, in Laos, these prices are largely based off getting dried chips to the Bangkok port. You can see in 2021, prices have remained very high, which has again pushed out that extensive margin, opening up new territories and the movement of planting material. This has resulted in outbreaks of pest and disease in new provinces where cassava has not traditionally been grown. The difference in the price between Thailand and Vietnam also influences the flow of roots and the connectivity between actors. And again, that incentive for a value chain actor to invest in delivering technologies to smallholders. Here you can see the price of fresh roots in Tay Ninh versus the price in Thailand. What's interesting again is the price of starch tends to be higher in Thailand compared to in Vietnam. So the Vietnamese processors have a very tough time in terms of remaining profitable as they compete for roots at a higher price and then selling to the global market, competing against the Thai market. This competition for roots sees the battlegrounds for securing roots between Thailand and Vietnam open up based on relative prices. And what we started in the previous project, we've continued looking at how different price scenarios influence the flow of roots and what that might mean for where we set up clean planting material, multiplication hubs, and which actors we can engage with. So I want to use this example here. When prices were very low in 2015, you can see that the Vietnamese market was only coming part way up into Karachi to Bong Kamong a little bit. Then this area in Karachi here was beyond the extensive margin for most fresh roots, and farmers were tending to make cassava chips that were going into Bin Phuoc. Beyond that, often farmers would not even see traders because they couldn't buy the chips at a price that a farmer would accept and transport them to market. During this period, often there's an encouragement for factories to set up. So if you set up a factory here, that happened in Karachi, this factory can secure roots without having to compete with the Vietnamese traders. So some might suggest this is a good model and you could work with this company here to build a multiplication of clean planting material and extension to farmers. But you only have to increase the price a little bit, and you can see that now the Vietnamese value chain can extend further up into Stung Treng and other provinces. The factory here now is competing very hard to secure those fresh roots. And their model about using here of paying less than the border price because they could secure roots for a lower price and then transport the starch starts to fall away. You can see here at a price of $75 at the Vietnamese border and $65 at the Thai side that we get a frontier forming in the west. Again, here you can see if the price is $85 on each side, now that all of Cambodia is covered, and maybe this factory now, if it was paying $80, would only secure some roots from up in this area. So the business model, if we were working with them here to produce clean planting material, has been completely fallen away. Again, at a higher price now, you can see the Vietnamese market really pushing towards the Thai market. And this is basically where it will stay. There's a lot of cassava being produced in here that's going into the Thai market, and the Vietnamese securing the rest. What this really tells us is that working with just a sole value chain actor is quite risky, and that, as prices fluctuate, that business model may disappear and we're left with stranded assets. So developing those public-private partnerships where we're working with government seems to be very important to ensure that we don't invest in infrastructure and business models that are going to fall away. Another activity that we've been working on is looking at what we can do with remote sense data to understand where there's areas of expansion, to understand where there may be high risks of disease outbreaks because of that planting material moving in, and also get some understanding of what's happening in supply. The issue of using statistics is they're usually 2 years out of date at best, and tend to be very inaccurate. So now we're hoping that we can start to use the technology that's being developed initially for looking for deforestation to identify areas where there's new clearings for cassava or changes from one crop to another, where this may mean that stems are being introduced and a hotspot potentially for a disease outbreak. The second part of the presentation is to look at some of the economic impacts of the adoption of some of the practices. Some of these agronomic results will be presented on Thursday, but just to give you a little bit of a flavour of what the kind of work that we're doing. And this is just scenarios, so don't really pay too much attention to the data. One of the things that we find is really important in scenario analysis is to use different prices to understand, what are the critical thresholds where certain business models may fall apart, and where farmers may change their behaviour. And now that we get these information is to really workshop those with different value chain actors. In this case, we're looking at the economics of the trials that will be reported on Thursday about using clean planting material or positively selected stems. So again, we're looking at a range of prices to look at what the impact of that may be. So the benefits of using positive selected stems under different price scenarios. So you can see at the low price scenario, positive selected stems are giving you a benefit of around $225 per hectare. But at the high price scenario, which is currently where we're at, using positive selected stems may yield over $1,000 per hectare benefit to smallholders. We could then look at what's the benefit of farmers buying clean planting material at different prices. So if it was costing us $3 per bundle to supply that, at that low price, farmers would actually be worse off by buying those. Again, at high prices, they're paying off the additional cost and making a return on that investment. We can look at what's the break-even price for buying clean stems. So in this case, when the price is $25 a hectare, farmers would break even as long as the price of stems wasn't greater than around $2.30. As the price goes up, obviously, the break-even price increases to $7 and $11.70 in this case. Of course, farmers aren't growing cassava just to break even, and we can start to look at some thresholds where we might think farmers may change their practices. A rule of thumb that's been used in the past is that you don't really get farmers interested in changing their practice unless they get around a 200% marginal rate of return on that investment. So for every dollar I invest in a change practice, I get $2 back as well as the dollar I invested. So again, if we say that farmers need a 200% return on investment, farmers wouldn't purchase clean planting material unless they could do so in this scenario for around 78 cents per bundle, well below the current price. At this price scenario, the threshold is $2.30, and again, as the price goes up, it might be closer to $4. In the results that, again, will be presented later, if we look at what would happen under this level of disease pressure if farmers didn't buy clean stems but did positive selection from their own field. And in this case, a farmer would be better off doing positive selection rather than buying clean stems unless the price of the stems was cheaper than 46 cents, $1.38, and $2.29 in this. So again, these are just numbers that we've worked with based on those results, and this is the type of analysis that we're doing as we go forward, and we get better information on what the penalties from using different disease status stems or new varieties might be. We can then start to look at what the potential impact would be if farmers adopted that at different levels of adoption rate. So under this scenario, if 10% of farmers adopted positive selection at this price, that would be around $3.7 million per year benefit to smallholder farmers. You'll hear a lot about cassava witch's broom and a lot of discussion about how important is witch's broom relative to CMD, and this is something that needs continued work. But again, you can see from some harvesting of some fields that cassava witch's broom impacts not only the fresh root yield, but also the starch content. In Vietnam, farmers are paid based on starch content, so if you start to factor in changes in price based on that, you can start to see the real impact. At the moment, a lot of farmers are converting their fresh roots to chips. And again, cassava witch's broom tends to impact that conversion from fresh root into chips. So in this case, at that yield, farmers were producing 24 tonnes of dried chips per hectare. And in this case, with witch's broom, 12 tonnes. So these two fields are quite close to each other. So that's a huge impact on farmers' incomes. You'll hear on Thursday that this is being done more systematically in new trials. The other activity that we will start to do is looking at under what level of disease pressure do farmers start to adopt potentially the first generation of CMD-resistant varieties. And again, there's a lot of uncertainty around that decision, so we will start to develop choice games to test with farmers. Again, this is using the results that will be presented on Wednesday from some trials in developing some scenarios where in one season, KU50 in a high pressure area had a very low yield, which would tend to see that farmers would change varieties to the new first generation resistant varieties. In other cases, the KU50 still yielded a much higher yield. And so you can see here if you were planting KU50 under this disease pressure compared to planting one of the new CMD resistant clones. So if you don't know the state of the world, which would you adopt? Would you stick with KU50 and hope for the best, or worry about the bad case scenario where disease pressure may be higher and you get less? So this is something that we're looking to test with farmers to understand how different farmers, men and women, people with different livelihoods, portfolios, may choose to plant potentially a variety that will give them a higher yield under certain circumstances, but more risky under others. This is going to be important as these first generation of CMD resistant varieties come out that may not have the highest yield compared to the existing elite varieties in a low disease pressure situation. So if we move to here where we have no data yet in Laos, would we already start to see farmers adopt some of these varieties, or will we not see that happen until you start to move towards a higher disease pressure? So these will be interesting games to play with farmers and other value chain actors. So again, those two activities are here, and you'll hear also on Thursday about some of the other choice games and experimental auctions we're doing with farmers about their willingness to pay. All this leads towards these sustainable business models for multiplying clean planting material and the multiplication of disease-resistant varieties under different partnership arrangements with public and private sector. Thank you very much for listening to this. Please feel free to put any questions in the Padlet, in the discussion board, and we'll have a discussion on Monday afternoon. Thank you very much.